All right, so after take 17, today we're going to be reading Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quilt by Deborah Hopkinson. Before I was 12 years old, I went from North Farm to Home Plantation because they needed another field hand. When I got there, I cried so much and I thought that I would never gonna eat or drink again. I didn't want to leave my mama. I'm not going back to her, I whispered every day to young Jack who worked beside me in the fields. Well, you better start eating all you can, Sweet Clara. He smiled at me, but then his smile was gone. In a low voice, he said, or else you won't make it. Young Jack helped me believe I'd be back with my mama someday. Truth was, I'd be lost before I got through the fields, them being so big and tall. But I didn't give up my dreaming. Aunt Rachel was raising me now. She wasn't my for real blood aunt, but she did her best to take care of me. One night she came back from working in the big house and found me lying dead tired on the cabin floor. She shook her head and said, "Sweet Clara, you ain't gonna last in the fields, but I got an idea." Aunt Rachel was sewing, and she started teaching me the very next day. It wasn't easy for me to learn. My hands had um, already rough and clumsy from hoeing and weeding the fields, so Aunt Rachel took it real slow. So she brought scraps of cloth from the big house and taught me about each one, how it was special and how to be treated in its own way. I like to piece the scraps together to make pretty patterns of colors, but Aunt Rachel didn't care much about pretty patterns. Now, you rip that whole row and do it again, Clara, she said. Why I got to make the stitches so tiny? I complained. Oh, I can relate to her. You're gonna be a real seamstress. That's right. That's why. Tomorrow, you come with me to the big house. I got it all worked out. Aunt Rachel said one day. I was frightened. You ready to be sewing with me? She went on. Mrs. Daughter Ella be getting married one spring. I told Mrs. I'd be needing some help. She looked at your work with sharp eyes. Clara, so do it correctly and neat like I taught you. The next morning, I tried to eat some cornbread, but my insides were all knotted up. I've never been inside the big house before or seen white people that close, except for the overseers. In the morning, sun was streaming in the sewing room. Everything was sunflower yellow. Aunt Rachel gave me some sheets to hem. Instead of being contrary, that needle did all I wanted, just like it was part of my hand. At the end of the day, Mrs. came in. "Let me see your work, Clara," she said. I gave her the sheet and she ran it through her hands real slow. I held my breath watching. From now on, come here, she said at last. When she left, Aunt Rachel and I looked at each other, about ready to burst. "We done it, girl," she cried. So I changed from a field hand to a seamstress. Since the sewing room was right off the kitchen, Aunt Rachel and I were near cook and the helper. There was always lots of bustle and company in the kitchen. I was hearing about all the kinds of new places and things. I listened so hard it felt like my ears must be growing right out of my head and getting big with listening. One day, two white men came to see the master. The drivers went into the kitchen to talk to cook. "There must have been many runaways last summer," one of the drivers said. "They gonna ask around all the masters in the county to join the patrollers." "Crazy runaways," muttered Cook as she beat up some batter. "Where are you gonna get to except lost in the woods?" "Don't know," said the other, "but I hear we ain't that far from the Ohio River. Once you get that far, the Underground Railroad will carry you across." "That's right," I agreed the first. The railroad will never get you. The railroad will get you all the way to Canada. Then you're free forever." Cook snorted. Ha! If it is that easy, you two let on, more would have gone up. One of the men replied in a quiet voice. It'd be easy if you could get a map. Walking back from the big house that evening, I asked Aunt Rachel about what I heard. Where's Canada? And what's the Underground Railroad? See there, Aunt Rachel pointed. That's the North Star. Under that star, far up north, is Canada. The Underground Railroad is people who'd been helping folks get there, secret like. She looked at me hard, but don't you start thinking about it. You run away and get caught, you're gonna get beaten. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Next day, I asked Cook, those two men that was here yesterday, they was talking about a map. What's a map? Just a picture of the land. That's all. Whatever's on the ground, a map can have it. Sunday, I went to my favorite place on a little hill and I looked out at the people's cabin and the field. I took a stick and started making a picture in the dirt. All of all things that I could see. But how could I make a picture of things far away that I couldn't see? And how could I make a map that couldn't be washed away by the rain? A map that would show the way to freedom. Then, one day, I was sewing a patch of pretty blue blankets, sorry. The patch looked just the same shape as the cow pond near the cabin. The little stitches looked like a path going all around it. Here it was, a picture that wouldn't wash away. A map. So I started the quilt. When you sew in, no matter how careful you be, little scraps of cloth always be left after you cut the dress or a pillowcase. I began to squirrel away these bits of cloth. When we was off to work, I went to visit the people in the quarters. I started asking what fields was there. Then I started piecing the scraps of cloth with the scraps of things I have learned. Aunt Rachel said, Sweet Clara, what kind of pattern you making on that quilt? Ain't no pattern I have ever seen. I don't know, Aunt Rachel. I'm just patching it together as I go. She looked at me long and she just nodded. I think she knows she's up to something. There was a buzzing in the quarters one summer evening. I saw the patrollers and I knew someone had run away. It was young Jack. But 5 days later, they caught him. The next day, I went to see him and walked to the top of the little hill. He didn't smile the way he used to. I took a stick and began to draw in the dirt. I drew a little square for a big house, a line of boxes for the cabins of the quarters, and some big squares for the fields east of the big house. I drew as much as I could piece together. Jack sat beside me, not saying anything, not even looking at first. Then he started seeing what I was doing. I handed the stick to him. I hear him catching his breath up. Then he began to draw. I worked on the quilt for a long time. Sometimes months would go by and I wouldn't even get a piece sewn in. Sometimes I had to wait to get the right kind of cloth. I had blue calico and flower blue silk for creeks and rivers, and greens and blue greens for the fields, and white sheeting for the roads. Mrs. liked to wear pink a lot, so big house, the quarters, and finally the big house at North Farm, they were all pink. The quilt got bigger and bigger, and if folks knew what I was doing, no one said. But they came by the sewing room to pass the time of day wherever they could. By the way, Clara, a driver might tell me, I heard the master saying yesterday he didn't want to travel to Mr. Moses' place because it's over 20 miles north of here. Or someone would sit eating Cook's dinner and say, so I could hear word is they gonna go plant corn in the three west fields on Verona Plantation this year. When the master went on hunting, Cook's husband was the guide. He came back and said that swamp next to home plantation is a nasty place. But listen up, Clara, and I'll tell you how I thread my way in and out of those as smooth as your needle in the cloth. Then, one night, the quilt was done. I looked at it and spread it in the dim light of the cabin. Aunt Rachel studied it for the longest time. She touched the stitches lightly. Her fingers moving slowly over the last piece I'd added, a hidden boat that would carry us across the Ohio River. Finally, they came to rest on the bright star at the top. She tried to make her voice cheery. You always did like to make patterns and pictures. Clara, you get yourself married to young Jack one of these days, and you two will have a real nice quilt to sleep under. Aunt Rachel, I couldn't sleep under this quilt, I answered softly, putting my hand over hers. Wouldn't be so restful somehow. Anyways, I think it should stay here. Maybe others can use it. Aunt Rachel sighed. But you ain't gonna need the quilt. Where you going? I kissed her. Don't worry, Aunt Rachel. I got the memory right in my head. Now, we're going to do part 2 in the next video, so I will wait for you.